Was there a key meeting or time or encounter that resulted in getting resources from ARPA?
Yeah, the key was Licklider coming and opening the office, and that he'd actually published something about man-computer symbiosis and about time sharing and interactive computing.
Now this was based on collaboration with that you'd had with him, or is this work he'd done separately?
That's how I sort of heard about him and read that paper and met him briefly. And then I learned that he had been hired to come down and open the Information Processing Techniques office. So we were sure to get a proposal to him the day he entered. And
was he immediately receptive?
Essentially. But as that friend of his told me, that Lick had to do it because here you'd been publishing and writing about it, so he felt you needed a chance, even if you were way out there.
Now, if you sort of go back to, we traced earlier when you were talking with John, we were talking about, you first started thinking about this in 1951, and in some sense really sort of said, this is where I want to go, and you had a vision that, how computers could be used and what this would do to the community and how they could use these for collaboration. Along the way, are there, in some sense, there was a meeting a year ago which was called the Unfinished Revolution, and so that sort of says the vision is ongoing, but a lot has happened, and beginning back in 1951, are there one or two or three places along the way that you can look at and say, then I really felt like we were getting someplace, that this was an important step?
Yeah, I think that, right on up through till like 77 when we got put out of business. Well, it was getting harder and harder for various reasons, but it was all very significant along the way. But since then, not really. It's the World Wide Web's coming and done a lot to help, get the world to get turned on. But there's just there doesn't seem to be any sort of dialogue environment for the larger picture. That, it's like if you talk to somebody and say, hey, there's an improvement infrastructure in society, right? Oh, never thought about it. Well, it's there because whatever gets the improvement is done by some infrastructure of that. Mm-hmm. And one thing to do would be to clarify it, and then when you make headway in this collective IQ, which is another important thing, you could plug that into that and we would get bootstrapping on a large scale. And so it's just...
I guess what I was wondering was, if I were to challenge you and say, Doug, what was the most important thing that happened in the 50s? And what was the most important thing that happened in the 60s, or between 65 and 70, or 60 and 65? Could you identify one or two events during those periods that really made a big difference?
Oh, I know one event was Bill coming aboard. You turned out to be an important event. Sure, getting the support and getting a chance to do it. Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, that 68 presentation was sort of a real gamble, right? Mm-hmm. And I never did find out about its impact over the ensuing few years, that there was anything noticeable, except maybe it kept ARPA going with us a little longer. Mm-hmm.
What was the immediate impact? Were we just inundated with people, or with response?
A number of people.
I would think so.
Charles Irby, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, came as a result of that. No question about it.
But I wouldn't say inundated.
Well, I'm just curious. It was, looking back on it, if you see the videos, they're just remarkable in the sense that they basically describe everything that we consider modern today, and this was 30 years ago. I would have thought that there would have been an enormous stir and uproar in the community about it.
Well, I would have thought that, a lot of organizations and activities would say, hey, let's go do that. So that's what the hope was, that there'd be a lot of things going after augmentation. Just essentially a silence. There wasn't. We'd get visitors who come and they'd look at it. Oh, they'd all very impressed. sort of by what we're doing, but it didn't seem to relate to their world.
Why do you think that was?
Just paradigms, just the difference in how they view the future potential and where it's going.
Bill, do you have any feeling on that?
I think it has a view, time scale, I think, is the key to that. Because Doug thinks very far out, very far ahead, and other organizations don't have that kind of sense of time for a number of reasons. They just don't think that way, and the other thing is financial. Because other organizations who might want something like this see that it's too far out of their reach. Let Doug do some more research on it, then maybe we'll have a product that'll work for us.
Sure, but why do we lose our funding, and why does the rest of the academics and the AI people all sort of put thumbs down? And why didn't Xerox invest something in things like this?
Well, that was a different story entirely.
Yeah.
Now I think people have a much shorter time scale and view of what's going to serve them in the near term.
Well, there's also a view of time scale, but the scale of the kind of change that's coming about and how soon, et cetera, is not there. That the amount of change per year is going up drastically. And you should be able to paint those pictures at least now and just say, look, you got to be prepared for looking farther ahead in event-wise or environment-wise, which is going to mean you're going to have to invest in looking and planning more than you ever had.
Of course, this is sort of an interesting paradox because, on the one hand, we have the tools now and we have the necessity for looking further ahead, but on the other hand, things tend to happen in a compressed time frame.
Right.
So, you have two things going the opposite direction. I mean, the need is in some sense growing, but the problem is becoming much more difficult because things happen so quickly and people's focus tends to be much, much closer in.
Sure, but I make a crude analogy of saying, okay, think of any organizations or any country or society or group or something like that. It's like everybody's in the same vehicle, chunking along. And if you're chunking along slowly and you can easily see as far as you're going to be in the next decade or something like that, and you don't need a very good vision, you don't need a very good steering mechanism, and et cetera. It can all be very clumsy. But as the pace picks up and the landscape gets a lot rougher, then you got to start thinking about how far ahead do I have to see and how do I have to improve my steering. And that's the thing, that's sort of the analogy, and that's just what it is. And so we're just saying, look, the kind of thing we're talking about of this collective knowledge work improvement can help us get better vision, can help us do the controlling a lot better, and it'd be very important. And and it's, it's in the funny place, the marketplace is sort of doing counter to that right now. And
even more so now than it was 10 years ago.
And part of that is that the marketplace works very well when the consumers are really tuned up to where they want to go. But if everyone is looking so close, they're not really being the kind of consumers that help steer where it's all going to go.
Okay, Doug, I'd like to pull together two things that we've sort of talked about here. One of them is this developing community at the Augmentation Research Center of people that were really focused on moving augmentation forward and doing all of the work, almost to the exclusion of almost to being a counterculture. And the other is what you just mentioned, which was that in 1968, after what I could only consider to be an absolutely mind-boggling demonstration at the Fall Joint Computer Conference, there wasn't an incredible inflowing of support and interest and money and everything else. And what's sort of in my mind, what I'm wondering is, is this one of the reasons that you had to have a community, that what you were doing was too advanced for people in society at large to really understand at that time, do you think?
Well, I guess I felt that you had to have a larger evolutionary organism, that just one laboratory, because it became our thing, et cetera, it wasn't going to prove that much to the world. And unless we really turned into really revising the way we actually thought and worked on all the conventions, and that didn't seem to work very well in there. So then we decided, well, we'll start getting an external community. And then there'll be numbers of clusters of groups doing their thing, and you can start getting them to watch each other and compare how they're evolving. So that's still a big part of what I think the kind of kick-off improvement infrastructure we ought to get going.
Is that something you saw starting to happen in, say, around the early 70s or something like that?
Do you remember the Quack?
I do
Knowledge
remember
Workshop
the Quack.
Architects? Yeah. That when we get a contract from some organization that we would support them for this, we're saying, essentially you're trying to improve your knowledge workshop, and we want you to appoint some person there that's, we call your architect of that, and we don't want it to be a software guy. Want somebody whom the other parties that are working with this way recognize that person knows our world. And so that's going to be our primary interface. And that person sort of, he's our customer in trying to improve the way that organization works. And we also then want to make a community of this. So we call them the Knowledge Workshop Architect Community. And everybody then, I got this right away, it's, what? KWAC? You're going to get laughed off the street. None will want to do it. But you remember, they got proud of it. In fact, when they elected their own president of it, they called him King Quack.
I didn't know that.
But that was actually the model now getting going of what we just feel is a very important thing on the outset, that you have to get multiple organizations, each trying to evolve, and you don't dictate to them what it is, but you make as much as possible available in information, models of the future, etc. And they have to get active in that among themselves, participating.
Now, in the end, how many different organizations were participating in that?
I don't know, 6 to 10, or I can't remember exactly. We could go back and find out. But they would really start cooperating. Like one of them says, I think I can get an extra $15,000 out, which in those days meant more than it does now. And we're wondering, it's to make some improvement in there. But what I thought I'd do is come here and see what you guys, as the fellow members of the community, what they felt would be the best way to use it. And sure enough, it was what another guy came up with the idea, they all agreed on, and that's where that money went. And that was just a beautiful example of the mutual advantage of collectively investing in that thing.
Now, Bill, going back to the 68 Fall Joint Computer Conference, I mean, you sort of were the primary architect behind the hardware, pulling this whole, all the making everything work and pulling everything together.
Right.
I mean, what was your feeling? I mean, did you feel that it fell flat, or that it was horribly successful, or that it, in and of itself, was all the success you needed?
Well, my real focus was on making it work, obviously, and I was convinced it would work. I could make it work. Had all the pieces necessary, and I wasn't looking at the far-reaching effects of it at the time. It was just getting the pieces together, which was a novel idea at the time, and making all that.
But you were in a position you could see the audience.
Oh yes,
And
I could see the audience.
I couldn't, so they tell me everybody stood up or something.
Oh yes, at times, tremendous reaction in the audience. It was really exciting.
But the lights were in my eyes.
Yeah, it was very exciting to see what was happening at that time. Yeah,
And did you feel there was an outfall of it later?
There wasn't that much. I mean, there was a lot of publicity surrounding it, but there wasn't an inflow of money. People weren't banging on the door with money. Not that many people. Charles Ergy came by. He was really sold based on that. So it just kind of went away.
Boy, it was
Got invited to do it again the next year at AFIPS, was it?
no, ASIS.
ASIS, yes.
But
And that had even less fallout.
yeah.
So,
But, for instance, I could have visualized that IBM would come by and says, "Hey, this really is a future trend. How do we tie into it?"
yes, I'm surprised more people didn't connect with at least the technology that was being shown, if not the farther-reaching ideas.
But then there was another funny thing that Andy Van Dam from Brown, who'd worked with, he had been a prep school schoolmate of Ted Nelson's. So when Ted was starting to write about hypermedia, and Andy was then a young professor at Brown, so they migrated together to start building some hypertext things there. And he was in the audience. And he doesn't seem to remember this because now he applauds it all of them, but he came storming up afterwards. Do you remember?
No.
And he was just sure we had only done the thing, mock up everything.
Ah, yes.
Like that.
Yes.
And he just felt outraged that we had done that when they were building something really workable. And we tried to calm him down. And what really calmed him down was we sent him down the next day to talk to Jeff Rulison, who showed him the architecture and all of the thing. And he came back totally, Andy did totally changed. He says, wow, you've just got architectural things to the depth, and it's all this is. So, but so it made me wonder how many other people may have thought that all of this was sort of a showy way to make a picture of what the future could be, but it's too out of this world for us to be serious about.
I think there was some of that in it. You know? Not, even though they didn't believe it was that it wasn't real. I mean, I think most people believed it was really happening on a computer, but they couldn't relate that to anything they could do.
Yeah.
I mean, we had a lot of resources in there. There's no question about it. There was a lot of money behind that. And for anyone to connect with the idea of putting that much money into a system that gave them a workstation that did this didn't fly.
That's because they were, in a sense, they hadn't really thought about
It didn't serve them in the short term at
Yeah.
all. You know.
And they couldn't look far enough into the future to see
And they
that-
weren't looking far enough in the future to see where it might go. Well, looking farther in the future really, as Doug says, involves community and a lot longer range research projects. What was needed was people who were committed to doing, let me use the word research in this. And that didn't come out of this.
But it's different from the academic research. It's sort of
Sure.
applied engineering,
Applied research,
exploratory
yes.
stuff.
No, it wasn't academic research. That's
And
an
so,
interesting difference because I never felt this whole program was academic research in any way.
And then we never had any success in getting, say, National Science Foundation participating because your proposals have to get peer reviewed again. And it just was outside any of the disciplines that the reviewers were oriented about.
So in a sense, this was basic research in a field that hadn't been defined yet.
Right, but it was like the engineering sense of it. You had to build these and use them to learn. You couldn't just make a toy that somebody could demonstrate and learn much out of it.
You know, that sort of goes to one of the first things I remember when I first interviewed with you to come work in your group. And this was something I think you did with most people, was you talked about how the tools affected the way we grew and the way we developed. And then you'd reach behind your desk and you'd pull out a brick that had a pencil taped to it. Can you tell me about that a little bit?
Oh, the pencil and brick. Well, he used that at a Stanford seminar first. That was.
Yeah, it was. If you try to tell a story about how new technology can affect the way you work and think and all of that, it suddenly occurred to me that's the positive augmentation. Oh, what about de-augmenting? So that's when I thought of doing that with the brick. So it's just like saying, just picture yourself that's the only way you could write. And oh boy, it was clumsy, your hand got tired, but just suppose that you couldn't but make an artifact. It was then easier to use. Would we ever have written language, or just you could just?
Well, that was you had them do it. You had them write with a
I
pencil
remember.
tied to a brick, and see how that changes your whole sense of what you're recording on paper. You operate differently. That was a powerful demonstration.
Yeah.
No question about it.
And the de-augmentation is actually the same thing you described earlier when you were telling people about scale. You had them get larger and find out what the handicaps were instead of saying what the benefits would have been in getting smaller.
That's right. But the scale change is just a very, very potent aspect of thinking about all these kind of concepts, is that you make a picture like everybody getting 10 times bigger, and then when you start explaining or examining it, you realize how many surprises there are to most people in there who are used to the environment as it is now. And that was true in looking at things progressively smaller, that geez, gravity just becomes no factor at all.
Yeah.
And the surface tension of liquids becomes so much that a little tiny thing can walk on it. And the flying becomes so much simpler. And so you just say, well, all those surprises just made me, just one time in there in about 1961, just suddenly look at listing all of the technology things I thought of, then look over, oh, look at what else is going to change. And this other list we call now the human system, I couldn't find anybody who had a name for it. Of all the things, every skill you have, even the way you conceptualize and transmit things to the outside world and your language and everything else is going to get affected. And with that kind of impact in there, who's oriented about that scale change? There're just bound to be endless surprises in there compared to what's today. Well, Jesus, we've just got to start learning about that surprise area. And anyway, that's...
I'm going to go back to the work environment a little bit and just the group as it grew. Where did people come from? How did people find out about the group?
How did people find out about the group? How did you find out about the group?
Well, I've sort of been floating around.
You were in SRI at the time.
And
that was easy once you were in SRI.
Actually, I think part of it was the Fall Joint Computer Conference and watching what you folks were doing. And I'd been right next door with Charlie Rosen working on Shaky the Robot and decided that probably wasn't the future and came down and talked to you folks.
I don't know how some of the other people showed up. I really don't. I mean, we know how Charles Irby got there. How did Jeff Rulifson get there?
Oh, there were two guys that knew him that didn't play that significant part. And they talked about their friend who was getting out of University of Washington and asked him to come by.
A lot of it was personal contact, that's true. Well, how did people like Dave Hopper get there?
I think he was born there, wasn't he?
Well, one thing I'd like to do is to get in touch with all of the people to find out what period were you there, for one thing, because I start getting mixed up about that.
That'd be interesting to do.
And why did you come?
That would be very interesting to do, see why people came. If you were already at SRI, though, you were bound to find out about this. And if you did and had the right mindset, you were there. No question about it.
And what would the right mindset have been, do you think?
Oh, just getting excited by what was happening. That's all, just being excited by the possibilities and what was happening. I think that's how Roger Bates got there.
Well, you know, his having played such an important role all the way through there, that I started to, whenever he'd get excited about somebody, that would make a big impact on me. Oh, well. So that probably influenced the far out guys, the rebels.
I remember one time, Bill, where we had this big Bryant disc on the STS 940.
Oh.
That
was on the 940.
Is that the one with the horizontal?
That was a marvelous Bryant disc file.
Oh, I'll try to tell people.
We used to talk about that and how many pounds per byte. And it was pounds per byte. I'll have to look up sometime the capacity of that. But
I think it was 40,000 kilobytes or 40,000 bytes. It was or 40,000 words, I guess.
Oh, it was more than that, I think. I'll have to look it up. But
maybe it was.
They were big 3-foot platters.
That's right.
I know, and when one failed, somebody got a coffee table.
But a week ago, I was down at IBM Almaden Research Lab, and they showed me something about this big with a little tiny disk about 1.5 inches across, like that, gigabytes.
Oh, absolutely.
Just
common today.
Standalone, something you could use as a plug-in card or something.
Absolutely. We can plug in big disks today.
Well, Bill, I have to ask you, I remember this, but I'd like to ask you, do you remember the time that the Bryant disc broke and it couldn't be fixed?
Couldn't be fixed?
All the folks came in from Bryant or whoever it was, and they worked on it for a week.
No, I don't.
And finally you walked down and you started poking around saying, what's wrong with this thing here? And pretty soon you pulled out, I think it was probably a flip-flop or something, they were all fairly big then, and you said, oh, there it is right there, it's a cold solder joint.
Yeah. Okay.
That fits his reputation.
Yeah. That was an amazing machine. But it made a real breakthrough in the ability to store information. That it enabled things like the NIC to some extent, because the ability to keep that amount of information accessible online made a huge difference.
Right.
Otherwise, we were spinning stuff off on tape, and forget it if it's on tape. It takes forever to find it.
Boy, I'll never forget, we had a visitor who came from I think Hungary, or at least some Eastern European country. And he was sort of a top professor, very bright guy with computer science. And he was looking around there, and he stood looking at that, and he was just fixated on it. And he said, in the most wistful terms I can ever think, he said, in all of my country, there's not that much. Nobody in my country has anything like this. So.
Yes.
And now everybody carries that around in their portable.
Oh,
Yeah.
100 times as much.
Doug, tell us where the name of the mouse came from. Tell us the story of the naming of the mouse.
That's a mystery.
Yeah.
There were perhaps 5 or 6 people involved in getting it made and tested. And we go back and talk, and no one can remember who first started calling it a mouse. I didn't. I don't think.
I don't know.
But it was perfectly obvious when the name came up that it was the right name?
Sure.
None of us apparently was a labeler, like I'm not a labeler. So
I mean, we had to have a label. We had to have something to talk about. In the first report, we had to call it something. There was joystick, trackball, etc. Graphicon, you had to call it something. Brown box with button didn't work.
What was it? An XY position indicator or something?
That didn't work. Short name. It had to be a short name, and it's a very obvious short name.
And Bill English, tell us about the competition. There were a lot of competitors for the throne. What else was in the running? Well,
there weren't a lot. One of the most common things at the time was a light pen, and we got a light pen from the Sage system, actually, and tried that out, and frankly didn't include it in the experiments because it was just so awkward to use. I mean, the kind of thing we were doing with it was very different than what Sage did, and the light pen was heavy, awkward to pick up, and by the time you got it picked up and in your hand and held it up there, it didn't work. Light pen was one of the contenders. A joystick was a major one that was used for ages, from flying airplanes to everything.
Was there one afternoon on which the first mouse worked?
Sure.
Tell us about were you there?
Oh yeah, sure.
Must have been.
I got it out of the shop and plugged it in.
Do you
and it
remember
worked.
what you pointed at? Did you point and select on the very first day?
Yes, of course. How else would it work? I mean, we tested the analog circuits already, as we mentioned earlier. These are analog potentiometers in here, and with a stop on them. So what you use is an AD converter. You transmit the analog signal back and interpret it in the computer, put up a put up the place on the screen, the marker on the screen.
Was the very first use of the mouse for text editing?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
No, for testing.
Testing, but text selection was the first object, was actually being able to, I mean, the goal was, we were working on text editing. The goal was a device that would be able to select characters and words. In fact, the tests that we ran in the experiment was based on single characters and words to get target size. So, no, you were asking about other devices. I can quickly open them. The light pen joystick were major ones. There were trackballs were commonly used at the time.
Did you compare it to the command key? The command key sequence of moving from letter to letter and word to word?
We weren't experimenting with commands. It was only the selection. The goal was to be able to point at something on the screen quickly.
Did he mean the cursor stepping keys?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Oh, step keys. No, we didn't use step keys at all. No, that was...
Wouldn't have a chance.
Yeah, that's very awkward. Didn't use those.
And for a long time, was there only one mouse?
Well, it wasn't very long before we started building the 3-button. I mean, obviously, very clearly you needed more buttons. It would be useful to have. A person could manage more buttons easily. So
Why, Mr. Jobs, how can you say that?
That was one of the greatest mistakes in product history, I think.
Yeah, me too. But people ask me once in a while, how did you settle on 3 buttons? And I said, well, that's all we could get on.
Exactly right. There wasn't room for any more.
But anyway, so this just started out with an idea I'd sketched one time. And when we're setting up the tests, I thought, well, is there anything we're missing? Oh, I wonder if. So I got out those brief notes and gave them to him, and there's the result. And
now, were there skeptics in the group? Later on, much later on, the mouse became a religious issue. Remember, in the PC industry, there was a lot of opposition
Oh,
at
yes,
first.
of course, but that was much later.
But in your group,
It was a very small group at the time, and we were very open to experimenting with pointing devices. No one had a preconceived notion that this was it.
In fact, for a while, we had one workstation, so when everybody sat down, they could use any of the devices
Yeah,
they
there were
wanted
several
to.
devices, they could plug anyone in.
And they all just, it just became the mouse was the only way that anybody chose after a while. But there are very interesting things that went on. Like one of the devices actually, when you move it around, actually had a slider out like this, and when it rotated, it worked one potentiometer, and when it slid, it worked another. So it gave the angle and how far away you were from the pedestal point.
Gave you radius and angle. A thing called the graphicon.
Right, so if you moved it in a straight line, it would go in an arc. And so if you wanted to move in a straight line there, you had to make an arc. And people would be using it not even knowing they were doing that.
You would never know.
They would just go like this to move it straight
It's
across.
very easy to use.
It was,
Even though you were following an arc with your hand, you could draw a nice straight line.
it's amazing.
and did you publish on the mouse at SRI and not until later at Xerox?
No, oh no, we published the mouse experiment. It was funded by NASA, I believe.
Yeah.
And in '64, we wrote a NASA report that compared the selection devices, and that introduced the mouse.
I've got a bulky set of the papers that you can look at.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think people read it and said, uh-huh.
Yeah.
You don't know of NASA trying to do anything
No.
application-wise?
No.
They were simply interested in command and control applications, or?
Well,
I think they had different needs for a pointing device, really. Perhaps
well, the reason we got that money was because Bob Taylor at that time was a psychologist in NASA headquarters.
right.
And he was trying to sort of get into this kind of part of the world. So he funded it through the NASA Langley Research Center. So even the money came from headquarters down to them.
Right.
And it was in 1965 or 6 that we went down there to try to sell them on the time sharing.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Very memorable event.
Now, at that point, the mouse was a way of controlling a cursor on the screen and selecting.
Yes.
Did you think about alternative technologies like voice, and were you thinking about other sort of?
I don't think we considered voice at all.
Voice didn't look like it was just over the horizon.
Well, even if it were,
Even if it were, it wouldn't be useful. I mean,
it's
sort of, once you think about what the task is, you can eliminate a lot of stuff that isn't going to work.
there were people like Licklider was sure that voice would just do away with a lot of this. And I try to tell him that, look, in the future you're going to be moving through this knowledge space, and it's going to be shaped much differently from it is now, and you got to go. And I said, sure, you can chunk along with voice recognition, like saying, get in your car and say, take me to the hardware store. But in the really working like that, it's be more like you're skiing downhill through a lot of bumps like that. And I said, just picture yourself talking your skis down that kind of route. See?
Not the right way to do it.
Not the
Right.
way to do it, no indeed.
That you're going to be really totally involved. You've got so much marvelous sensory, perceptual, motor stuff that can learn to just go where you can see.
But what's striking in what you're saying to me is that early you had this notion or this vision of a three-dimensional space of information that you would be able to move through.
At least 3. Well, that's why right on from the beginning we made the hierarchical thing in there, so that then all kinds of ways to move into that, and with optional views. And gee, I just can't imagine why people stuck. They got so proud in this someplace in the early 80s or something, or 70s, where you could do bitmap. And so then you could have on there what you're going to see when you print it out. And I'd say, okay, but actually printing it out's the last thing you want to do. It's when you're finally done. But gee, you're just missing a whole bunch of what else the computer can do for you.
Well, that came pretty clearly in the JFCC presentation. And I wanted to go back to the JFCC to get a little bit of your sense of what you mentioned just previously, that you really didn't have a sense of the audience response from where you were sitting. What were you thinking while you were showing people?
Just just very glad that it wasn't breaking down, and distracted because he, in sort of directing everybody to be ready for the cues, I could hear in my earpiece. So I had this thing of juggling that to know how soon somebody was going to get ready, or if they weren't ready, then I could go longer in one piece or something like that, but also keep speaking. And every once in a while I would make a verbal faux pas.
Like, what's an example?
Well, like the computer would be immediately responsive, I mean, see.
Now, maybe you could just sort of describe the whole FJCC setup, just the big components. I mean, there was a component down the peninsula, and then what were the...
Well, the biggest component was the projector, of course. We had borrowed an IDA 4 high resolution for the time, 1024 line television. Our whole system was based on 1024 line television. And we had borrowed this IDA 4 projector, which is a large projector that projects a very bright image. It has an arc light. And I won't go into how it does it, but we borrowed that, and it's huge and very bright. And it's the only way we could project on a 32-foot screen across the top of the auditorium. That was a major piece of it. The other pieces were getting the video from Menlo Park up, and I arranged with Pacific Bell to lease us 2 radio links to carry video. 2, we always had a backup. We had doubled everything for backup, and we used both of them because as long as they were both up, we could use them. So we had a video link, and we just connected that to our video display in Menlo Park and displayed on the IDA 4 projector in the auditorium.
And were you a director in the back of the building?
I was in the back of the auditorium, right.
And he was also doing the video switching.
We had a primitive video mixing device. We could do horizontal and vertical cuts and fades, very primitive and simple at the time. And we did that, and that's how we did split screen with people in Menlo Park and Doug.
And did you have, while he was making the presentation, did you have a sense of the impact it was having on the audience? Did you get this sense of, you know?
Well, I could see it. I could see people reacting to it, but you know, that's tempered with the fact that I'm really concentrating on making it work and coordinating the roles of various people. So I guess the director, if he's directing at the time, has a little trouble seeing the reaction.
And
but
what
I did
happened
get
afterwards?
It.
What happened afterwards?
Oh, everybody, you know, standing ovation. People went up to talk to Doug about it. People came back and talked to us on the platform about how did you do this? And great reactions at the time.
There really had been nothing like it before.
No, nothing like that kind of presentation, what Doug was showing. I mean, there'd been big video presentations before, but
What we were showing.
I mean, there are people who argue that that was the seminal moment in modern computing.
I wouldn't dispute that. I think it really was.
That it really, basically people's minds were blown.
Mm-hmm.
I know people whose minds were blown. I know people whose lives were changed by that demonstration, who had just never seen anything like it. And were you nervous, Doug?
Sure. You know,
It looked pretty calm to me.
well, there are little things like if something had crashed and had been a faux pas, and somebody went and complained to ARPA about, hey, this mess coming up there like that, and ARPA would say, what presentation?
Exactly.
Because the guys there knew we were going to do it, but they say, look, I can't authorize that, just don't tell me.
This was a bootleg operation. It really was.
And whose idea was it to put on a public?
I'm sure it was Doug's. Yeah.
It was just,
Let's see what we can do with this. He was invited to do a presentation at FJCC, and then
so then we just said, well, we've got video here and these things, and we had exposure to this IDA 4 projector, which was a beautiful, beautiful phenomenon, the way it worked. So we proposed it, and then actually, a rare thing, they actually sent a site visit committee down before they'd accept this proposal, because it was so unusual, and they wanted to see that we could do it.
yes.
And one of the things we were challenged by is, hey, this doesn't sound so new. Somebody said they'd seen the same thing at NASA Langley. Do you remember that? And I said, oh, well, that's our system running on it.
Yes,
Isn't it right?
yes.
Oh, so you had already had it up at NASA.
Yeah.
Not the projector, but the system.
But the system.
System, yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we had to go down very interesting series of events that Bill, again, things we couldn't have done without him, but we wanted to get some movie pictures of this in the early stage of this editing and such as that. So got a movie camera set up, movie camera, and we put a shroud over the big display, and you had to get under there and work it like this so they could capture that. And we went through a series of basic things about viewing and editing and jumping like that. And so then there was an ARPA principal investigator meeting in MIT a little bit later, and sort of a weird circumstance is Bob Taylor, who was the ARPA guy at the time, said, well, who's going to start? How about you, Doug? And I said, oh, well, I have a movie to show. Oh, well, great. So we projected the movie. And that really, I had said several years earlier to an MIT group that improving the speed of response is going to keep giving you value until you get diminishing returns, maybe when you get below a quarter of a second response. And everybody there was typewriter and everything like that. And that you could just feel the whole audience just turn disbelief or something like that. But anyway, this movie just showed them. Because boom, boom, things were happening. It was very crude. So then later on, Bob Taylor said at a break, he says, well, Doug, what was it? It says, I think the trouble with you is you don't think big enough. Well, what do you mean? Well, what would you really like to do? Oh, I said, we'd like to get a time-sharing computer. Anybody set up a lab where a bunch of us could work on it simultaneously. And, well, okay, write a proposal. And so then it turned out he again could do that through his old connections in ARPA down at NASA. So that he said, you'll have to go down and sell the guy who's head of information resources at NASA Langley, who was kind of an old line computer guy, et cetera. So Bill and Jeff Rulison and I went down there, and that was a real critical time meeting those guys.
Was it a hard sell?
You know what better than I do.
Well,
I don't remember much detail about
it was, because he was...
Yeah, of course, it was a hard start, but we got the money.
Yeah, somehow we sold them.
So earlier you mentioned, I know the demonstration included hypertext, and earlier you mentioned Ted Nelson. How did you meet Ted Nelson?
Oh, he came out to see you, didn't he?
Sometime it was, I can't remember when it was, but...
I remember the Ted Nelson visit. I don't know when it was, but...
What did Bill? What did you think of him when you first?
A little
met him?
crazy at the time. Yeah, it was a little extreme.
And did he have the hypertext idea when he came out?
Yeah.
He had it independently, I'm sure.
That was his. That's what brought him out.
And did you have something to demonstrate to him at the point that he came out?
Yeah, we were pretty far along. I think we had the 940 by the time he came out. In fact, he went and sat down in Doug's office at his display with him.
And you remember anything about the session? No. It was early on. Had he written Computer Lib by that point? This was after or before Computer Lib, do you remember?
I don't remember.
I don't either.
Because many of the ideas filtered out that way.
But I just think he contributed a lot to getting people to talk about it, et cetera, and we have different ideas about how it would work, et cetera, what details in there, but he's very creative. And so we've been friends. I think we intend to stay friends, that sometimes people try to talk to us and get us polarized.
Yes.
Now, somebody also mentioned that at one point Arthur Clarke visited.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about Arthur's visit.
Well, Elmer Shapiro's wife, one of the guys who worked for us some part-time, was another part of SRI. His wife at one time had been an assistant to Arthur, I guess in the East Coast or something like that. So he was touring and he wanted to do something in the Bay Area, so they were visiting together, and Elmer brought them both into our lab. And it was kind of kick, so I'd read some of his stuff like that. And so he looked around, and as he was leaving, it was about the only time I got close to him, and he said, gee, I write science fiction all the time. He says, but really, you got things here that are almost as unreal. He says, this is science future or something. Anyway, so that was a rewarding feeling.
how did you decide on the number of buttons to go in the mouse?
Well, obviously, when we were testing it, all you had is a selector. Because of the position of the wheels, that looked like a reasonable place to put the button. But later on, we could think of more functions, so we started building them to work in the lab. Our engineer creating them, and I would like lots of buttons, but we could only, I guess the limitation was how many that day.
There was really only room for 3 with the buttons we had and the room for the wheel. We didn't want to expand the mouse too much.
Right. So I've got a strong feeling that people can use a lot of things.
This is a case of function following form.
Yeah. And so
That's right.
Sometime we,
Absolutely.
at the same time, we'd been experimenting with this chording key set. And so the two of them working together had a lot to do with how we built it.
Why do you think the mouse gained acceptance but the keyboard didn't?
I guess just a universal perception that that's very hard to learn.
Well, I have a little different perspective on that. I think the mouse added a real capability that everyone needed. What you do with the key set, and in fact what we did at Xerox and the first product was have command buttons. They're not as flexible as the key set by any means, but that you could do things. We had a keyboard at SRI with a delete, word, delete, and all of those on buttons on the left side of the keyboard. So you can make up for some of the key set need by buttons that are not as flexible. One of the big things about the key set is you could type on it, and you could type commands, limited typing if you got fast.
But you could easily evolve a whole vocabulary of verbs and nouns, and the command recognition thing made it pretty efficient. Often 1 or 2 characters would flash up what you wanted. So you start thinking about what you want to do in the terms of that, and the vocabulary would steadily grow. And it was just as effortless to get those, and it was clear that the time it takes to go click on something for like a menu, by the time you go click on something, you could be hitting with a key set 3, 4, 5 characters. And the selection was never worth that much information. Plus, you had to do it after you selected what you were going to do like that. So the other way, you can be telling it what you want to do on the way. So when you get there, so it's doing in parallel and more efficiently. And the vocabulary, the growth of the verbs and nouns that you guys, after you left, were just a lot of them.